Hello everyone, welcome to the day 4 of Azure Learning Series. This is Lakshit Pant from Azure Developer Community, and today we are going to talk about Microsoft Azure Networking. We will discuss about how Microsoft Azure Networking will help you and how you can just build what are these NSG groups and multiple security related things that comes in Microsoft Azure Networking part. And today for the same, we have our expert speaker, Samik Roy, with us. He's a Microsoft certified trainer. He's a senior cloud security architect, and he's the best person to help you with this topic because we have already conducted multiple sessions together, and he is the expert session who can guide you in the best way possible. So today we are going to be do everything in a hands-on manner. So not missing much more time, I'll quickly pass on the stage to Samik sir. So over to you, sir.
Thanks a lot, Lakshit, for sharing, and everybody, welcome, and thanks for your time for the session today, and a special welcome to those who are kind of repeating and then joining once again, right? Hope this session will be useful for you, and during this session, I'll try to keep the slide less, and we'll try to look at the Azure portal to see the things in live and to the best possible way. And in the meantime, if you have any question, feel free to paste in the chat, or Lakshit is there to help you out with the answers, or we can definitely pick it up time to time, right? With that, I would like to get started, and let me share my screen. And once you should be able to see my screen now.
It's not visible yet. It's
It
yeah, it's here.
if
Yeah,
you
it's here, sir.
could confirm as well. Great. Wonderful. Great. Thanks a lot for Azure Developer Community, for hosting this wonderful session and series to help you out with learning Azure. So with that said, myself, as Lakshit mentioned, myself, Samik Roy. I work based out of Bangalore, and I'm a cloud security architect. And I do talk in community over cloud security network. Oh, these are my details, and feel free to reach out for any questions, any suggestions, any discussion you want to have around Azure security, Azure networking, things like that. You can get my LinkedIn through the QR code scanned. And with that, without much delay, what I would do is I would quickly get along with the agenda today. So here is what the agenda looks like. So basically, this might look little bigger than my usual session, but fundamentally, the reason I've kept the agenda this way, because just so that you are aware or you are familiar with all the components which come with Azure networking. Maybe these are not, we may not be able to cover all these things in a short session today, but these are the things basically which comes as under the umbrella of Azure networking, right? We talk about introducing what exactly networking mean, and how do we go about that, right? And obviously we'll try to jump onto Azure portal time to time, and see how they look like. All right. And with that, let me go to the first one, right? So just a little storytelling here. If we talk about Azure networking, right? So fundamentally, if we take Azure outside and then only talk about networking, networking is, by English, networking means you can connect, you can manage your connection securely, and Azure provides you a skill for those the same thing. So whatever resources you have, and if we look at today, right, even from mobile, right, whatever service we access, everything happens through a network. So we connected to internet connected to Microsoft center, they go virtual machine, right? And there are different layers. Sometimes they are done for the ease of access. Sometimes they are done to make sure that you are having a secure connection. Sometimes they done to do both, right? Mostly in an enterprise scenario, we need to make sure that whatever connection we are making, for example, you being a developer or me being a developer anywhere, or we are like a SOC analyst or in security, if we are trying to access either from our home or our office, we need to make sure the connections and the way we transfer the data, that it's all safe. So So Azure networking terminology is something which helps us, getting that secure and able to connect to the desired resource where we want to. Now, to look at, and I've intentionally plotted like a axis. So if you look at the x-axis as like things you can learn over time, and the y-axis like the more you go, the depth you go, the better you understand for each topic. And Azure networking is not something like a single thing which can cover, or there's a symbol of which covers all of these. Rather, it basically talks about getting couple of products or getting couple of services together under the same umbrella, so that you basically can do your stuff and then connect to the desired resources. And either you are a developer, or you are into an administration, or you are into security, network is something a must thing for everybody, because without understanding network, we'll never be able to catch if there's a bug, right? Is it because of internet connectivity, or is it because of network connectivity, or is it because of application bug, right? The first level of segregation is done by network. So that's why network is very, very important in terms of whatever role you are in, or whatever role you're aspiring for, right? So if we look at a little bit around the components, so first of all, we say, we try to do configure some virtual networks, because those are the fundamental blocks of Azure, right? And in the Azure, what we see is, once we configure virtual networks, they are mostly a logical blocks around virtual networks, and you can create multiple of them, kind of mix up and make sure that where you fit in, right? Then once you have done the grouping is more of logical segregation, where you want to keep the resources like a VM, like a Azure SQL Server, like any other database, and things like that. Then once you're done with that, basically we go for a network security group. So network security group is again a logical set of certain rules, wherein you can define, right? From a dev network, you don't want you know any access to the prod network, right? So NSG, network security groups, are kind of things we basically kind of use here. You can put one on top of another, defining priority, right? And assign some weightage to the group, so that whatever takes priority depends on how you configure them. Next, being in Azure and on-premises world, we can definitely configure something like Azure Firewall, and that can be your gateway to access any of your Azure resources. And then we can also talk about hub and spoke network model, where you have a hub centralized model, which kind of wherein you land in always in hub, or you have spoke access. So it totally depends on what kind of complex network you are. The next thing is, again, it's not something which is called Azure DNS, which is not something you get every other customer, but Azure DNS is a DNS offering. For example, you want to set up something private, and you want to have, let's say, a log analytics workspace with a private DNS, or with Azure DNS, which can be only accessed from your non-premise network. You can definitely do that. Next, the moment you configure firewall, the moment you configure DNS NSG groups, you will get a scenario where you do that routing configuration, right? For example, someone is hitting a public IP address, right? So based on public IP address hit, you should redirect him either to a load balancer, if it is a production server, or it's a production service, or you can directly point that connection to a virtual machine. If it is a dev, that's where the routing of endpoint comes into play, right? The next one, I say, again, we talk about load balancing, and the name itself says, whenever we talk about load balancing, the moment any traffic comes in, let's say we are running a production workload, all right, and let's say multiple request comes in, which is very, very obvious thing on a production case scenario. So load balancing is something which you configure, and there are various ways to configure that. Talks about based on connection, incoming connection, where exactly it should be going. That's what the configuration talks about, right? And sends it to the underlying space or app, wherever you want to. The last one is the gateway, and that's like the key. So if you really want to channelize your traffic through a gateway, you should be able to do it, and that's also a part of Azure networking umbrella. So as you can see, this is the building components, I would say building blocks, series of steps you need to configure. You may be doing some of them, skipping some of them based on your enterprise scenario or based on your use cases, but these are all possible cases. You can pick one or more of these, one or more of these, to configure your particular Azure networking, right? So with that said, I would quickly kind of see what virtual means. So if we break down the word called virtual network, so network is something, even we sit in a network every day, we access our router, we access our internet. It's network, right? And virtual means it's a logical segregation wherein how you kind of want to position your resources. Let's say you have 50 virtual machines in Azure, right? Now wherein you want to plan them, where you want to keep them, you can actually, for example, you can have one virtual network wherein you can have dev server, which is maybe a Windows virtual machine. Then you can have a Azure SQL database. You can have another virtual machine where you have the application hosted, right? So something like that, and everything can be configured within a single virtual network. And like this, you can have many depending on your scenario. Now, just to break it down with a little detail, or if we go deep down, what exactly and how do we go about creating virtual network? So this chart gives you kind of an idea how to plan the network. So when you plan, basically we understand what are the resources going to be there, and things like that. Then we first to create a subnet, right? So subnet is like, again, subnet is, as the name says, subnet is a section of the virtual network. And obviously after that we can create virtual network. And the moment you create a network, right, as per world www standards, you have to have an IP address, right, to access it. So now that can be private, that can be public. For example, if you are inside a VNet, right, where you have dev resources, which talks about VM, a SQL server, so you can definitely need to have private IP addresses to talk to each other. Otherwise, you cannot. So the network interface card sitting behind the scene, that has to have an address, because let's say when you are inside a virtual machine and you say connect to my SQL server, right, and give an IP, give an address. Basically, if that IP address works, then that, if it is private, it goes through the same VNet, to the public cloud. Now, the same thing, like you have a production case setup, and people are interacting with each other, you want to access it from outside, that you create kind of a public IP address. Now, creating is one of the steps, but apart from creation, you definitely need to associate both private and public, IP addresses to particular resources, right? Then only they will be like functional. So just to kind of go a little bit of details, what are the steps we should follow? So we fundamentally, when you plan, right, we do a logical representation. So as you look at the image, right, we see a subnet, and then, as I talked about, we have two virtual machine, for example, two have its own network interface card, then subnet, and subnet sitting and contain resources from your own premises, right? That's something obviously as a logical representation, right? And maybe if you're not in a hybrid scenario, you can definitely do a dedicated cloud only subnet, so wherein you have all your resources. So same scenario, instead of on premises, it can be the cloud environment, right? So that's called cloud only virtual network, right? And if you want to have hybrid, you have to make sure that you are secure, and that's how you network between your public and private IP addresses. And also your networks, it's on premises or in Azure, right? Now that leads to a planning of enabling hybrid class scenarios, because you will definitely see places or environments wherein you might need to deal with only cloud, you might need to deal with on premises and cloud, which is a hybrid use case scenario, right? So now Once we complete this planning, what we do is we try to create subnets, right? And as I talked about, subnets are nothing but a segmentation, right? And there are different ways to calculate when you plan or create subnet. If you look at this image, right? So we have subnet 0, 1, 2, Azure Bastion, and things like that. And every subnet has a range. So that range is like 24 by 24 is like, the number, by 24 you 27, the number. So that's a calculation you do, right? So that's fundamentally you understand the things detail around kind of how many numbers we are having here, right? So yep, that's something I would say. And to understand more about it, what we can do is there's a virtual network segment, you know can be there for one or more cases. There is a virtual network segment, it can be there for, the subnet provides a logical segregation and things like that. So basically, the subnets provide a logic version network. That means you can basically amplify things over the period of time. And subnets can also help in improving the security, because with subnets you can definitely segregate how many nodes are there inside. And each subnet have a unique address within it. So just to look at, if you look at this subnet, there are like the first one, though the first and second is with slash 24, but the base address are different in this case. Kind of the different subnets are available. And also, once you have the subnets created, right, you can definitely see the number of IP addresses are available within the subnet. So just to create an IP address, it will be very difficult to kind of change that. Because once you create and assign IP address, it will be very difficult to kind of change that once it's now. To look at the next step, uh, we create the virtual network. So obviously this is a wizard based step in Azure, where we create a virtual network. So you can just create a number of virtual networks at any point in time. All it needs like a resource group to be created, and then you know um, to attach that network to a virtual machine. That means you are tagging that virtual machine, for example, as a part of the network. uh, you need to define the address space as well, because that's where the VNet comes into place. And it should have at least one subnet, right? That's how it has to be. And when we do that, right, we need to be careful and calculative about not overlapping the addresses with each other, right? And that's how we go about creating the virtual networks. The next one is plan the IP addresses, because you have numbers of IP addresses, and there are two different IP address types, as I mentioned. One is private, one is public, right? So whenever you are inside a virtual network, and let's say there are two virtual machines in the same network, you can obviously talk to each other using a private IP address. But if you want to access it from internet, one of these resources, right? Now it depends on your planning. You really want to have one particular IP address and then route that IP address to both the virtual machine in a different way, or like have different public IP addresses, and try to connect with them. So this basically talks about kind of a thing that it totally depends on your configuration, how you plan the IP addresses. And each IP address type has a different flavor, right? And they have to be created and deleted. So yeah, that means once you create it, it's not that once it's assigned to someone, right, it cannot be changed until unless either restart or disassociate or delete that, right? Now, just as a part of public IP address, if we go a little deep down for public IP address, the way it can be created, it can be either created as an IPv4 address or IPv6 address, or you can have both of them actually as a part of that address, right? Now, just to look at, and obviously you have to have a unique name to it. As usual, you can have a dynamic assignments, you can have a static assignment, whatever you think it's works and good for you, right? So that's something we need to think about whenever we are trying to create a public IP address. Now once we have a public IP address created, right, so we just need to look at this is a little chart table wherein you can associate a public IP address with a virtual machine, with a load balancer, with a VPN gateway, and and an application gateway. And where exactly you associate, right? So you can associate for a virtual machine, you can associate with a NIC card, right? That's network interface card. So in the load balancer, we do that, the public IP configuration in the front end, and for the VPN gateway in the IP configuration, and again in the application gateway, it comes back again into the front end. And we can have dynamic and static assignment for both of them, right? And as I mentioned, static is something which is like once given it's fixed until unless we change it. And dynamic, it's it depending on, for example, if we have a dynamic IP address now and we are connecting to a VM, now we restart the VM, the IP address goes away, next time a new public IP address assigned, and that's like we mostly will not get the last IP address what was assigned to it, and that's what called dynamic assignment. Now to look at what are the resources it is compatible with, it can connect or associate with the virtual machine, it can associate with the load balancer, it can associate with the VPN gateway, it can associate with the application gateway, right? uh, Now if we look at the different type, which you call it like private IP address, right? These are the options, because private IP address, as I say, can be only recognized by internal resources which are available within the same VNet. And that's where the assignment can be limited, so it can be only assigned to a virtual network interface card, internal load balancer within the same VNet, right, application gateway. And in here, the allocation or assignment is by default dynamic. We can do it static, and mostly we should be doing it static, because if it is internal, right? So for example, you have five virtual machine and there are five developers, we are connecting to each of them, and each have like 10.2.2.0.1 and 0.2 0.3 and like this. So now next time we connect, and sometime we need to take each other's connection over the period of time. If we don't set to static, we'll never know, and it will be really a tricky piece to kind of look at, and find out that particular private IP address, right? So that was kind of the summary of how do you do your virtual networks. So once again, you plan, you create virtual networks, you create subnets, you plan the IP address for the public IP, you create IP address, you associate both public and private accordingly. So that was around talking about associating public IP address and private IP address within virtual networks. Now, if we look at If we quickly look steps, but these steps are needed, and again, you can definitely create your own flow, but fundamentally this is a flow which you have created to make sure that if you follow that, you understand the process step by step, right? So fundamentally use a network group. First of all, you just implement, and then that means you create, you determine the rules, you determine the NSG effective rules, and we come back in a while what is effective rules, create NSG rules, right? Fundamentally, this is what you do as a part of NSG rule creation, right? uh, just to look at in details what exactly network security group, implementation means. So that means, by doing this, we would say, we can let the network administrator go from there. We limit the security rules that's kind of denies or allows a particular traffic. For example, if you are again coming back to the same example of dev machines in a virtual network of 5 virtual machines, right? So if you don't want that to be accessed by anybody other than dev, you definitely kind of need to worry about, or need to make sure that you configure your NSG accordingly, so that you basically stop access for other cases, right? So, and again, once you have that, you have can associate it to a subnet or a network interface, so it can be dedicated. You can apply a network security group to one of the NIC card itself, or and you can associate to a subnet itself, so that works at a higher level, right? The next piece is like, once you create an NSG, that's kind of works as a template, right? And once that happens, you can definitely associate with VMs, NIC card, or maybe a subnet multiple time. So that means it's basically reusable. All right. So that's fundamentally about implementing rules, right? How do you determine what are the NSGs? And if you look at the details around there, right? So the fundamental rule of using NSG is basically to control over the traffic, right? And that traffic can be anything. It can be public traffic, that can be within the VNet itself. So what are the ports? So you can even control what are the virtual network you want to allow, and specifically say that, okay, I want only remote desktop connections to be enabled, right? So that say, right? Oh, that's about kind of how do you determine as your rule. And fundamentally, by default, right, what happens is
Hello, sir. Hello, sir. You are on mute. Hello, sir. Just 2 seconds ago, you got. Hello. So your mic by somehow you got muted. No, sir. You are on mute. No, 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 sir. Not yet. You are still on mute, sir.
audible
Yes,
now?
sir. Now you are audible. Now you are audible, sir. Yes, sir. Now you are audible.
Wonderful. So forming same subnet, piece of it, you can have
Hello, hello, hello. I'm sorry, sir, but again, you went on mute, sir. Yeah, hello, everyone. I'm really sorry for the inconvenience caused. There, I seems like there is an connectivity issue from some mixers end. Till then, if you have any doubt, any query, please let us know in the comment section. Or I've already posted the attendance form link right over here, so you can just check this out. The attendance form link is already available here. You can fill out your attendance on the same basis. You will be getting the certificates for this workshop. So please fill in the attendance form. Yeah, some mixer is here now. Yeah.
I think now you can put me back
Yes,
and
sir.
let
Yes. Yes, sir. We
one
can.
sorry for that
No,
inconvenience.
sir.
So as you can let me touch your screen. I think it's not shared yet, so I'll share my screen. And you should be able to see my screen now. So
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's
back
visible.
again. So fundamentally, let me tell you, I've logged in and kind of wanted to show you any what exactly the NSG looks like, or what should I do. So in this scenario, what I'm trying to show here is to show you virtual machine. And what do you do is anytime we can go to, this is just how to see things. You have access to the Linux distribution under settings. I'll network tab once again. And once I go to networking, we should be seeing that. Yeah, as you can see, this basically talks about, this is my network interface card, and their effective security rules, and this is the subnet. So a VM what I've created is associated to a subnet. So if I quickly, and also you can see this has a public IP address assigned, and by default it has gone dynamic. So anytime I kind of restart that, right, it's gonna change. And this is the private IP, and the private IP is 10.1.0.4. That's because if I quickly jump on to the virtual network associated, that ties to really what we talked about. We create a virtual network, right, and we have the network, and we create resources to use that network. So let's say you have created a virtual network, and then you have the subnet within it, and that kind of really a /24 subnet. So it really have 200 plus IP addresses. So you can start creating and associating virtual network. And we are already in, as you can see, the resource type is virtual network, and I will quickly go to the subnets from the left navigation directly. So once I do that, as you can see, it is defaulted to like /24, and there are 250 IP addresses available, right? So yeah, I can always manage users who can do that, and then and once it's created. I can always create one more subnet. So if I just create one more subnet over here, I can give it a name, and definitely we can define. And you can see here, the moment I said create a new subnet, this subnet starts with 10.1.0.0. Azure has automatically picked up the next one is supposed to be 10.1.1.0. That means there should not be any overlapping or clash, right? And it also talks about the moment to create a new subnet, there are 5 Azure reserved addresses that's internally used by Azure itself. You can always define a network access, NAT gateway. You can, as I talked about, and the reason I am just able to select one of these because as I talked about, network security group, once you create it, right, you can associate multiple times. So as many VNets I create, I can connect with all of these. Routing table, there's nothing. And then if I want to, the routing table will be needed as a case whenever, let's say we have a public IP address and then we want to route something from that public IP address to some other VNet machine, right? We use routing table in that case. Services, I'd say, yeah, I don't want to specify something, let it be the way it is. Subnet delegation if it's required, that's fine, otherwise not. And obviously non talk about policies, right? But and uh, you can also add IPv6 address, and then yeah. Now let me try to cancel this and then say okay, because you have canceled it. And if I click on default, the one which we have already created, you can see it talks about what is the current configuration it has, right? And you can look at all these things. Now I say close it out and kind of go back to the previous set in the breadcrumb, and you can see once in that VNet, right, you have incoming rules. So these are kind of, you know this is the network security group, as you can see attached, right? And based on these rules has appeared. So if I quickly click on this network security group over here, that's going to take us to the respective network security group assigned. And you can see in the group you have everything whatever we could see there. So the inbound security rules and the outbound security rules, and so on. So right? So what I would do is go back again using the previous step. And obviously if you are using this network security group in multiple places and you want to change or add something, let's say you are using in this network security group in 5 virtual networks, right? And then you want to have allow one more particular service which is hosted in Azure SQL, or maybe in a virtual machine, SAP, or any other system, right? You want to allow that, right, RDP from there. You just add that in this group, and then fundamentally go back, and then you could see here, right? And yes, the view is a little different because it is listing only the inbound port rules. We have outbound port rules as well, and we have application security groups as well in case it's not configured. So as the load balancing comes into picture, where we have production level application, and then we want to balance it and then send the traffic according to certain details, right? And this is my unp config, which is primary, right? So you can always attach a different network interface, and that's the fundamental. So most probably it depends also on the system you are using or the resource you are using. Does it allow attaching or not, something like that, and how many you can have primary, things like that. So that's kind of thing I just wanted to kind of show you here. Now you can also see there is a private IP address. So again, if I go back to the virtual network, right, and we came here a while ago and saw basically what is available like 10.0.0.1, and as it mentioned, it has picked up 5 IP addresses which is reserved, and that's where the first virtual machine is assigned at .4, right? So that's pretty much it about this demo. And once again, though we'll try to have some time at the end of the session, but feel free to post any questions you have. All right. And yep, you can see all these VMs, and then what are the details you have, what is address space, and things like that. And here's the firewall, and by default firewall not be configured at a desk scenario, but you can configure firewall. And then so you can also do this VNet peering on here. So with this VNet peering, what happens is you can add another VNet. For example, there is a dev VNet, right, who does application A, and there is a dev VNet 2, which is like for application developer group 2. And at some point in time you want them to collaborate with each other, so you just do VNet peering. They should be able to peer and access each other's kind of networks, right? So that's something I just wanted to show as a part of live demo, right? So let us quickly switch back to the slide once again, and quickly complete at a high level what exactly we are talking about. So the next one is, we talked about Azure Firewall, and we keep it really simple for understanding. So how do we configure Azure Firewall? It's basically determining the use of Azure Firewall. Do we really need it? And fundamentally, at a production case scenario, we'd be needing it. Then we're going to create the Azure Firewall, and then we're going to create the Azure Firewall rules, right? What should be like inbound, outbound, and what are the rules we have. And the next one is basically an optional case, and mostly enterprise customer will have that, but everyone may not be having it. It's called Azure DNS. So you can identify the domain and custom domain, you can verify the domain name, you can create DNS zones, right? So from on-premises days, zones are like different aspects of a domain controller. You can delegate DNS domains, you can add a records with the DNS, DNS zone. You can obviously have a private DNS zone. You can determine what are the other scenarios you are going to cover, right? So that's something I would say was available, right? Now, apart from that, we also talked about a little bit around network routing and endpoints. So for example, as I just to give you, so there are like 5 virtual machine and a VNet, and then based on certain criteria, we want to have only one public IP address, and then put some configuration around, from so and so condition, get to this machine or get to that machine, things like that. So that's where you get your network routing endpoints, and that's basically basing on a public IP address, what is available. You connect to a public IP address, and this routing table connects, make the connection and passes the connection to a private Azure resource, which is inside a subnet. And that's the whole and sole purpose of routing endpoint. So the way you do is, what identify what the system route needs. Does like the scenario you're working on, the project you're working on, does it need routing? Yes. Then identify what are the user defined routes, and set up at least one of them to test it. And then demonstrate that testing, and then determine what exactly you need, how many you want to keep and how many you don't want to keep, right? The next one I would say, just for the understanding of the complete picture, determine the, that's for Azure load balancer. And then the way we do it, determine load balancer uses. And if we find, okay, we need load balancer, obviously production case needs load balancers, we implement that. We determine what SKU of load balancer, like which category of load balancer we need. Create the backend pool. For example, load balancer is the first layer. So load balancer works is to get the traffic and pass the traffic. Now, after that, once you create the backend pool, you also need to create the rule and obviously create the session persistence. For example, you are hosting an application where an user is logged in, and some of the, for some reason, he got routed to the second server, and then he should have that session persistent from the previous server. Otherwise, if it is authenticated system, it will just terminate the user login session, and then there'll be user anomaly. So make sure that session persistence is available. That's again a part of the configuration. And the last next one I would say, and this is like, again, to complete the set, it is more of a Azure application gateway. So we implement the gateway like a small scale. We determine what are the gateway routings we need. So mostly the important piece here is the routing, and then we set up application gateway components, right? So that's pretty much it, I would say. We should be kind of looking at from an application gateway perspective. Now, again, just to coming back to the first one, to get the whole and sole idea what we have seen. So I'll quickly go over there. All right, so we talked about what networking means, and that's like more of a bigger umbrella. We looked at configuring virtual network in theory and in portal, what it looks like. We also looked at network security group, right? How exactly it looks like, and then how one single group can be reused or reconfigured for multiple network interface card or multiple VNets, right? That's kind of a reusable component. Then we looked at or understood at a higher level what firewall is, what Azure DNS is. We also realized that at times there might be a need of network routing, because based on whatever public endpointing being accessed, the private endpoint might change, and that's where we might need a routing. Now, routing is something, it's still you access one resource, you are routed to another resource. But in case you are hosting an application which will be accessed by many, now one server, right, cannot be serving all those things due to two reasons: due to the load, due to the dependency. So that's where this load balancer comes into the play. And then Azure application gateway is something which is based on what you need, you just design and implement that. And obviously I've seen some components in the portal, and now I would like to give it back to you for any questions you have. And obviously, thanks again to kind of for being there with me in this session.
Yeah, so we do have some questions. So the first question that is coming up is why we need these network security groups. This is the
Mhm.
first question in the community. Yeah.
Okay, so that's really a great question. So why we need a network security group? So let me try to pull out my Azure instance. So if I am connecting, for example, I'll go to NSG rule, network security group. So let's say you were sitting in an Azure environment and you're setting up the Azure environment. So if you look at this is a set of configuration, right? Allow RDP and allow deny load balancer, things like that. So similar kind of configuration might be needed for multiple cases. So let's say you are running a pool of databases. In databases, you might not want some connection to be connect from internet, and some connection to be connect coming from your dev instances or things like that. So that rules, right, that rules can be configured and clubbed as a part of NSG and can be reused, right, for all such cases. And again, your NSGs need not to be super complex. You can have multiple NSGs applied on a NIC card on a virtual network. So it need to be like realistic, and once you do a change, right, let's say you want to allow one server from or one port to all your database server, you just do one change in NSG, it gets reflected right away in all your VNet resources. So that's kind of the reason we need this particular NSG
Yeah,
or
and the
network
follow-up
security.
question for the same is like the follow-up question, can you please explain the RDP connections? I can see that on the screen. This is the
Okay,
follow-up
so
question.
that's really a nice, again, once again. So for example, if you look at 300 is like, yeah, what I have done, because I work in this environment, right? So I have to take an RDP connection. So this is really a good example. So I can obviously delete it or I can try to catch it. But what happens is with this NSG rule, it talks about you are allowed to have any TCP rule to take a remote desktop to that machine. Now assume that this is a production server, you don't have this rule. That doesn't make sense because you cannot let anyone RDP to that. So similar to RDP, right, you can do multiple other things like you know uh, creating or allowing SQL. So like 3389 is the RDP port, right? Similar to that, the Linux SSH port is 22. the DNS port is 53, right? So for example, if you're setting up a DNS server, instead of this one you have to have 53 open, otherwise DNS will not work, right? Similar to that, 1433, if I'm not wrong, that's the SQL server port. So if you're dealing with the database, you need to make sure that that's allowed to be connected for that server. So these port numbers are dedicated on a particular protocol. So that's why this is needed. Obviously, if this goes to the production server, we never need that. And if you can tune it to a particular piece that allow this port only, like source and destination, you can see it's any, right? So let me go back. Right.
Yeah.
I'll just add
Okay. I
directly
hope
one here. So to show you.
that, yeah, I hope that
Yeah.
answers your question. Okay.
So you can see
Uh,
this one, and then yes. So port ranges. Yeah. Obviously, you can see a list of IP addresses. I mean, you can really configure it and narrow it down what you want and what you don't want it to be allowed. Right. Yeah.
yes.
Any other
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
question?
Okay. So we got interesting question. So, okay, Sneha is asking. I can see inbound ports and outbound port rules over here. So, okay, what's this? Okay. Yes, I can understand inbound port rules. These are the people who want to connect to a particular rules. But what is the out? Okay, yeah, she's
Hmm.
asking what are the outbound port rules and how these are differ each other.
Makes sense. So for example, right, so outbound rules. So let's say if I've written an application which goes to internet. So let's say I'm in my application, I'm just doing an IP address check, like IP address and validation. I'm going to, let's say, virus total or any of that IP vendor who is like public. So for that I have to make sure that the server my application is hosted, that application should be able to go over to other application. So let's say you have an application server and you have a database server, right? Now, based on whatever application you write, you'd like to connect to database, right? Now you have to specify that, okay, you cannot keep the server open. You have to tell, okay, I'm an application server. If I'm an application server, allow this server to make a call or make a network connection to the respective database server, right? And that's 1433, right? And that's why you can see it's like mostly deny, and then yeah, obviously something like that. So fundamentally the outbound is like you should be able to take RTP connection. Let's say you are connected in a VNet, and that VNet has other four networks. So now if you want to ping or if you want to connect to any of the four machines, right? If you don't have outbound port rules defined for that, or your VNet don't have that NSG configured, right, you can't do that. Hope that answers.
Yes, I hope that Sneha that answers your question. And is if there, so I can see this only. These are the questions that I can see over the screen, guys. If you have any questions, okay, yeah. Another question is on subnet. Can you please explain the question, the role of subnet here? Subnet and
So
significance of VNet architecture. Yes.
okay, so now again, that's really a great question. So VNet and subnet. So VNet is the bigger umbrella and subnet is inside that. So now if you look at this particular structure, right, virtual network slash subnet. So that means your virtual network is a logical segregation which can have one or more than one subnet. So if I click on that, right, so it will take me to a page where it will see it is a default subnet. At least you have to have a VNet, right? You have to have a dedicated one subnet inside it, and that subnet you can really, again, I'll go to subnets. So you can have multiple subnets within a VNet, right, for your logical allocation of IP addresses and resources. And you can basically do peerings within VNet. So let's say you have one VNet with five subnets, right, and you have another VNet with another five subnets. You can basically peer them together, and that's how the hierarchy is built, right? So that's kind of hope I was able to get you the closest answer.
Yes, that's a perfect answer that you could mix. And is there any
Yeah.
question, guys? Please let us know in the comment section. And rest of
And
okay, yeah, okay, yeah. This is yeah. I'm sharing on it. Just a second. Okay, someone is asking for your LinkedIn profile. So yeah, I'm on it. Just a second, guys. I'm sharing some experts LinkedIn profile. Okay, here it
okay,
is.
and also, I would like to. I posted a question in LinkedIn a while ago. Uh, Register if I'm not done, and then what is the best case of using your static IP, Express route, DNS server, VM within a VNet, within a subnet, and I think I did discuss through the session, right, that VM is the best case because, for example, there are five developers in a VM. There are five developers using five VMs, and then they interchange machines or they want to reuse the machine with each other. Now, if you have a static IP assigned, like this one, right? If I go back, so if I go back in here, uh, and if you look at this IP is dot 4 and this is static, assuming that this is dynamic. So every time I have to come here and see what is my IP. Otherwise, I know it's fixed. And once I'm in that VNet, I always connect to the same IP using the same private IP address or static IP address, right? So that's something I just wanted to bring up, right?
Cool.
Anything else, guys, want to?
Yeah. Anything else, guys? Please shoot your question. Okay. Okay. Riaz is asking, can you explain Azure DNS in shortly?
Again, so Azure DNS is something. So, for example, if you talk about DNS in general, right? DNS is like your domain name resolution service, right? The same thing is available in Azure, right? So let me try to get that. See if I can. And so directory. So should be. But however, again, if I can, go back to DNS. So I mean, this is if you want to use Azure as a domain name resolution. So you have your on-premises server, and then you set up the server, you set up the domain, anything you type, right? Anything you type. Let's say you type, uh, Bing.com or Microsoft.com. That goes and goes to DNS and kind of gets a resolution in done and give it IP address on behalf of that, and then goes back to Microsoft website. That's like a public DNS what it does. So same thing you can configure for your Azure instance or Azure environment, and you can do your name resolutions over there. So it's like a simplified version of DNS or flavor of DNS available within Azure as a product, right?
Right. Anything else, guys? If you have any question, okay, no more questions. Perfect. So thank you, everyone, for for spending your 1 hour and learning Azure networking. It was, I hope, that was insightful session from Samik sir because he has explained every topic. He has touched every point very clearly, and with the hands-on part, it was like icing on the cake. So I hope everyone got insightful insights today about the Azure DNS, subnet, and whatsoever it comes in Microsoft Azure networking. So this is all about the networking part, and tomorrow we'll be touching more on the AI cognitive part. So join us for tomorrow to learn more about AI and cognitive services in Microsoft Azure, so that you can explore how the ML works. And because has been recent announcements about OpenAI services and multiple things, so it could be very interesting day again tomorrow, like today. So thank you, guys. Thank you for joining in, and I would really thankful to you, Samik sir, for giving us your precious time and joining us for this session. It was really insightful to hear from you and to get your to
Sure.
hear from your knowledge. It's a
Thank
pleasure to
you.
host you, sir. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, joining. Thank you, Samik sir, for joining
Sure.
in.
Thank you. So yeah, and anybody have any question? Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Yeah, and I have already pasted, by the way, the Samik sir's LinkedIn over here, so you can just shoot out if
Ah,
you can just type his LinkedIn
right.
anytime.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have any
Thank you.
questions, just let him know in the LinkedIn profile. So thank you, guys, for
Yeah.
joining in. Have a great evening, guys. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye.